Spaced is a sitcom that ran from 1999 to 2001 on Channel 4. It concerns a precarious flat share in North London shared by the barely adulting duo of aspiring cartoonist Tim and aspiring journo Daisy. For the soon-to-be household names of Edgar Wright, Nick Frost and Simon Pegg, Spaced wasn't given a long lease, running for only 2 short series. Nonetheless, it managed to craft this homely feel of a sitcom that really found its foundation in the culture of the late 90s. In fact, it gives us a window into that culture that's now swung round into the present day. The 30-year cycle has made the 90s trendy again. But when I watched Spaced recently, I started to feel resentful more than anything about the world it depicted. Is there a theory as to why it might provoke that response? Besides being a bitter, dejected millennial? This video, beyond an attempt to cram as many cumbersome puns into one paragraph as possible, is an attempt to answer that question. What does Spaced tell us about the UK that produced it, the UK that consumes it to this day, and the difference between the two?
Oh, well, of course you must have vegetables!
The year is 1999. Edgar Wright has just finished working with David Walliams on a strange black comedy called Asylum, set in an asylum about an asylum. Wrong! It was about enhancing the careers of 90s comedians. And 2 of the 90s comedians trying to have their careers enhanced were Jessica Stevenson, or Hynes, I'm gonna go with Hynes, and Simon Pegg. His name is just Pegg. So Edgar meets these folks and he thinks they've got a good thing going, vibe-wise. Hynes and the Peggster have been writing the script for a sitcom, a proper sitcom, with acting and jokes, but most importantly, chill-out music. Pegg plays Tim, Hynes plays Daisy. They approach Wright to direct because they find his facial hair to be enticing. I'm not going to back that up with a citation. Anyway, Wright helps with, shockingly, the writing and helps amp up the jokes in the edit suite. If you watch Spaced now, you can really see the guy's formative style of smash cuts, transitions,
Hello, Timmy!
and musical cues that all try and generate a layer of comedy on top of the raw footage. This was also paying a kind of homage to an up-and-coming American comedy format, popularised by Matt Groening.
This idea that we could use what The Simpsons does, which is basically a device where you adopt and you appropriate shared cultural references within the script, and suddenly it feels very real, but it also then elevates it into kind of a magical place.
But as Hynes also notes, they wanted to make the comedy salient enough such that it would work even if you hadn't seen whatever reference it was that they were referring to. So while Spaced might seem referential in principle, it absolutely has its own voice. And arguably, that's what carries the programme. Not the cultural artefacts it references, but the way it references them. But precisely because Spaced has all of those touchstones of late 90s and early noughties culture in it, it does end up being a bit of a beacon for that period of time. What the zeitgeist, or time ghost, happened to be. That's also because its creators were explicitly trying to craft something that was, in some respects, a more accurate representation of 20-something life than what was already available.
The shows of the era that were about people our age at the time were written by 50, 60-year-old white men. And so we thought young white people would be better.
Also, Spaced was driving to combine the experiences of both male and female 20-somethings, looking to accurately reflect both sides, instead of an overtly masculine piece of programming. What's more, the characters were based on people Hynes and Pegg knew in waking life. Not that such a thing is uncommon, in fact it's the backbone of most stand-up comedy, but in this case it really helps reinforce the relatable angle of the TV series. When strange things do happen in the show, which they do a lot, they're basically played straight by the cast, which further enhances the particular homespun brand of comedy at work here. In sum, the programme very much invites you back to the 90s and invites you to take your shoes off. A bit like Trainspotting, but slightly less off the rails. So why does any of this matter? What does this atmosphere, this 1990s-ness, tell us about Spaced and tell us about ourselves? Well, having briefly cited Frederick Jameson there, I've got a clear runway to exclusively yammer on about Mark Fisher, as if I've never done that before. In his 2014 book, Ghosts of My Life, Fisher discussed a multitude of his own cultural touchstones in relation to nostalgia and loss. Hauntology is the big beacon of thinkery here. It's a pun on ontology, the study of being, with hauntology used to refer to things that are no longer in being or not yet in being, and how we might relate to them. A ghost never dies. It remains always to come and to come back. Now, the pun might seem quite theoretically challenging, or even linguistically challenging. But to be fair, the original term, Hauntology, is deeply French, having come from Jacques Derrida's Specters of Marx, and I am not French, so Fisher pulls the term from Derrida's discussion of possibilities of capitalism and communism, but deploys it instead in relation to culture, specifically modernist culture, from the white heat between the 60s and the 80s. He laments how the conditions that made that culture possible have disappeared, and hence we now see culture repeating itself more often. Despite all its rhetoric of novelty and innovation, neoliberal capitalism has gradually but systematically deprived artists of the resources necessary to produce the new. So Fisher leans into hauntology, the graspable morsels of culture beyond monotonization, to describe both the cultural ecosystem of the past that's disappeared and the potential cultural ecosystems of the future that no longer seem possible. Far from the idea of famed 30-year cycles, we are permanently eschewing the production of new cultural ideas, instead opting for parroted prefabs based on what we already know. It's in this context of hauntology that we can look at how the 1990s we reproduce today differs from the images of the 1990s in Spaced. Clear as day, the central conceit of Space, a flat share found in a local rag for a bargain price, is now the exception, rather than the rule. The idea that someone could do what Daisy did and squat across London for 5 or so years is now mired in the admin of property guardianship or the threat of illegal eviction. The little pockets of rebellion that somehow existed in real estate have slowly been eked out and turned over to capitalism. And now, renting in London is so much more precarious than it was in the late 90s, which also means it isn't accessible to half as many people as it was back then. That's what I think makes contemporary 1990s-ness even more of an artifice, even less of a real dedication. People who reenact the tropes of the 90s today can only do that in pastiche, because half of the conditions that made those tropes possible simply don't exist. This brings me round to another turn of phrase, the sort that really jumps out, more so in an American context, from works like Douglas Copeland's Generation X or Helen Childress's Reality Bites. And that phrase is yuppie. Back in the day, a yuppie was a young professional, exactly the sort responsible for the early days of gentrification. Someone who'd profit from the vice of neoliberalism, but aspire to a certain cultural new, and probably use words like cultural new to try and prove that they had cultural new. And it's weird that this word, yuppie, not cultural new, fell out of fashion, because it's almost more relevant than ever. The sheer level of representation, or perhaps better put, misrepresentation, of cultures from the past by people who live sad imitations of those lives is, at least anecdotally, completely everywhere. Just think about the skyrocketing prices of vintage clothing, vintage bikes, flats in mixed neighbourhoods, high quality 8-inch pressings, Ben Stiller films, or disgusting natural wine, and you'll get the idea. Except maybe forget the natural wine, but don't forget Ben Stiller. He's slightly less disgusting anyway. Suffice to say, the unwritten code of middle-class life continues to subsume everything that was cool in the past, even though the culture of this particular past was predicated on an accessibility that's been perverted all backwards like. The subsequent ideological and practical attack on public services meant that one of the spaces where artists could be sheltered from the pressure to produce something that was immediately successful was severely circumscribed. And of course, that means it's even less likely that our generation will have as diverse a cultural backdrop as the ones that came before. As I already mentioned, this was already sort of happening in Spaced. Much as it might have aspired to be deeply original, it still had to thrive on the relatively novel basis of referentiality, introduced by the sheer mimetic potential of fast-moving nerd culture. Seems like even Spaced knew we were going to become doomed to repeat the past. The upshot is, if we're watching Spaced now, we shouldn't wallow in the way it depicts a life we resent aspiring to. We should, instead, as Fisher arguably suggests, consider more carefully what we've lost since the 90s, ponder how we fell astray politically, and home in on new ways to get somewhere better.